Welcome to our channel. Today, we're embarking on an exciting journey into the wild and fascinating world of the Apache Outlaws. This is more than just a tale of rebellion and outlaws. It is the story of survival against overwhelming odds, the fight for freedom in a world that was rapidly changing. Their story is woven with themes of resistance, loyalty, betrayal, and ultimate sacrifice. These Apache warriors were not just criminals. They were symbolically and literally fighting to preserve their very way of life against an invading force they could not defeat on their own terms. Their legacy, full of intense chases, incredible escapes, and unyielding resistance, has been immortalized in the myths of the American Wild West. Let's take a deeper dive into their world, beginning with one of the most iconic photos of Apache scouts during the final years of the Apache Wars, an image that captures the spirit of these men who had once fought alongside the U.S. Army, only to turn against the forces they had once served. It's hard to imagine the complexity of the situation that faced the Apache scouts. These men were not born to be enemies of the U.S. government. In fact, many of them had once fought with the Army, recruited because of their unparalleled skills in tracking, knowledge of the land, and ability to communicate and understand the strategies of their fellow Apache. They were scouts, trackers, and guides for the U.S. military, indispensable in operations during the Apache Wars. Their skills made them highly sought after by the Army, who valued them as key assets in their mission to quell Apache resistance across the southwestern United States and northern Mexico. However, these scouts, who had been essential in the Army's campaign against rogue Apache bands, were also part of a broken, betrayed people. The very same scouts who had once helped the Army track down the rebellious Apache were also caught in a moral conflict. They could not forget that they themselves were once Apache warriors, descendants of proud nomadic tribes that roamed the desert and mountains of the Southwest. The Apache were people who fought for their independence, their way of life, and their dignity against overwhelming odds. When the U.S. Army forced the Apache onto reservations, it was a life sentence. The reservations were places of suffering, where the Apache were treated with disregard, where starvation, disease, and corruption were rampant. The once free people were now confined to lands that could barely sustain them. The transition from fierce warriors to agricultural laborers was too much for many Apache to bear. The harsh conditions on the San Carlos Reservation, which became known as Hell's 40 Acres, broke many spirits. This is where many Apache scouts began to feel a deep internal conflict. They had once fought to protect their people, but now they were being forced to live in conditions that stripped them of their identity, their pride, and their purpose. As the years passed, some of the scouts became increasingly disillusioned with their role. They had fought against their own people for years, hunting down renegades, helping the Army, and assisting in the capture of those who resisted the reservation life, but the betrayal they felt was too much. These scouts who had fought so hard to maintain their people's way of life now found themselves torn between their loyalty to the Army, the Apache tribe, and their own survival instincts. In time, some of these men like Massai decided they could no longer live with the guilt of their role in betraying their own people. They turned against the Army and began to form their own outlaw bands, attacking military installations, ambushing trains, and robbing supply caravans. What started as an attempt to resist their oppression eventually turned into an all-out battle for survival, a fight not just for freedom, but for dignity. Massai was one such man who had been caught between two worlds. Born into the Chihan Apache tribe, he had grown up surrounded by the traditions and customs of his people. Massai was a skilled hunter, tracker, and warrior with a deep knowledge of the land and the natural world. When he was recruited by the U.S. Army to serve as a scout, Massai initially believed that he could help maintain the peace and protect his people. After all, the Army's promises of security and resources seemed like the only way out of the starvation and deprivation on the reservation. But as Massai continued to work with the Army, his disillusionment grew. He began to see the reservations for what they really were, prisons for his people. The life he had been asked to live as a scout for the U.S. Army felt increasingly like betrayal. He witnessed the injustice faced by the Apache on the reservations, and as the years went by, he became increasingly frustrated with the oppressive conditions. It was clear to Massai that the Apache were being broken, their culture crushed beneath the weight of the U.S. government's expansion. In 1886, the story of Massai took a dramatic turn. The U.S. Army had launched a major campaign to capture Geronimo, a notorious Apache leader and outlaw, who had led several raids across the border into Mexico. The Army knew that the only way to track down Geronimo was through the help of Apache scouts. Massai, who had become one of the most trusted scouts of the Army, found himself at a crossroads. As he helped the Army track and capture many of his former comrades, including leaders like Geronimo, he was torn between his loyalty to his people and his commitment to the Army. When Geronimo was captured, Massai was celebrated as a hero by the Army. However, to the Apache, Massai had become a symbol of betrayal. He had helped capture Geronimo, a man who was fighting for the same freedom Massai had once desired. The man who had been a scout for the U.S. Army was now seen as a traitor by his own people. To escape the harsh judgment of his community, Massai fled the reservation, determined to leave behind the life of a scout and a man caught in the middle. Massai's decision to break from the Army and return to the wilderness was not just a physical escape, but a journey into the heart of his own identity. The story of Massai's escape from captivity is one of survival, resilience, and profound personal transformation. In 1887, Massai, along with his companion Gray Lizard, made a daring escape while being transported under guard to a military prison in Florida. The two Apache scouts were shackled together, separated from the other prisoners. As the train chugged up a steep incline, Massai saw his chance. He and Gray Lizard managed to loosen the bars on a window and, as the train climbed slowly, the two men jumped out of the moving train. They hit the ground and rolled, barely escaping the guards' attention. In the dead of night, they disappeared into the dense forests, their journey towards freedom just beginning. For the next several months, Massai and Gray Lizard embarked on a perilous journey across the country. They had no money, no map, and very little food. They traveled only by night, evading both the U.S. Army and bounty hunters who were on their trail. The two men relied on their training, using stealth, patience, and the knowledge of the land to survive. They encountered numerous challenges along the way. On more than one occasion, they had to steal supplies from unsuspecting settlers, taking only what they needed to survive. They faced the brutal heat of the desert, finding water in the most unexpected of places like cactus plants, which they carefully cut open to extract moisture. In the high mountains, they faced freezing temperatures. Using the fur of animals, they hunted to fashion makeshift clothing. Despite their best efforts to stay hidden, the Army was never far behind. The tension between life and death was constant, and every decision could mean the difference between survival and capture. The duo was constantly on the move, evading detection with careful planning and execution. In the years that followed, Massai's legend only grew. His name became synonymous with the Apache resistance, the image of a man who had fought, fled, and survived against insurmountable odds. He became a figure of myth, a man who could never be fully captured, who had managed to escape from one of the most well-guarded prison transports in history, and who had roamed the western deserts and mountains as a ghost, hunted but never caught. Some believe Massai continued to evade the Army for many years, hiding out in the remote mountain ranges of Arizona, New Mexico, and Mexico. Others say that he was eventually killed in a firefight with Mexican soldiers or U.S. Army troops. But there is no conclusive evidence about his death. Like many legends of the Wild West, Massai's fate remains a mystery, and his name has lived on as one of the most iconic figures in the history of the Apache resistance. The story of Massai is one of survival and transformation. It's about a man who was forced to reckon with his past actions, torn between the duty he owed to his people and his role as a scout for the Army. His journey reflects the complexities of loyalty, identity, and the painful consequences of being caught between two worlds. Massai's name lives on as a testament to the strength and resilience of the Apache spirit, a man who defied the odds and continued to fight for the freedom of his people, even if that fight meant becoming an outlaw. The full saga of Massai, from his early days as an Apache scout to his later years as a legendary outlaw, is one of epic proportions. His story is not just about rebellion and violence, but about survival, identity, and the human struggle against oppression. Like all great outlaws, Massai's legend has transcended the events of his life, becoming a symbol of resistance, perseverance, and the enduring desire for freedom. His story is just one chapter in the long and tumultuous history of the Apache people, whose legacy of defiance against overwhelming odds continues to inspire generations.